Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Jim Olson, Assistant Executive Director of the NTCA, and I want to thank all of you for attending today. Today's webinar is titled Surface Preparation for Tile and Stone. This presentation will cover the growing importance of surface preparation in the tile industry. We will discuss the practical applications and challenges that installers face, as well as the industry standards and guidelines. We will also discuss the types of products and preparation methods that have historically been used, as well as the latest trends and product advancements. Our sponsor for this presentation is Mapei. Now, before we begin, I have a little bit of business to take care of. Today's webinar will be muted. Please use the questions area on your computer to type in your questions, and we will answer your questions at the end of the presentation. All of our webinars are archived and available to watch at any time after the webinars are presented. I will provide my email address on the chat screen when we begin. Please email your requests to me. It'd be great if you do it during the program, because once it's off, you're not going to be able to do it. So I'll look forward to hearing from you and get your emails. If the audio on your computer is poor, call the number on your invite to this webinar and listen on your phone. Here we go. Today's speaker, Logan Reavis, is the Manager of Technical Services at Mapei. Logan has been with Mapei for over 5 years, and he is responsible for the Product Support Department, Architectural Support Department, and the Regional Field Representatives. Logan grew up around floor covering, and shortly after completing his Bachelor's of Business Administration degree from the University of Texas at Arlington, he began his career in the industry. He brings over 16 years of experience in floor covering after spending time in distribution and on the floor contractor side of the business. I want to welcome Logan. We look forward to this, Logan. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate that. It's my pleasure to be here. And, we're going to talk today about surface preparation, obviously, for tile and stone. And that's kind of what you're looking at here on this first picture is an example of where you can kind of end up on a tile installation when when you've been unable to achieve proper substrate preparation. And as we kind of roll through this, as Jim said, feel free to submit your questions. I have been around the industry for a long time, and I'll try my best to answer them. But I certainly don't know everything, so I always look forward to getting input from all of you out there. So the thought for the day, and when we talk about tile and stone and substrate preparation, you see this quote here, and it's talking about a flat substrate making all the layers above it easier to install correctly, but that's signed by every carpet, vinyl, rubber, and wooden flooring installer, but you don't see tile installers on there. And the reason is because this has not really been a huge concern on the tile side for a long time, and where the guys that are used to worrying about getting a perfect subfloor and getting a nice flat subfloor and prepping everything correctly are the guys on the soft side of the industry. And so again, this is why this has become such an important topic on the tile side, and we'll kind of get into why that is and what are the different techniques and kind of how historically tile guys have approached that, as well as what some of the newer technologies and techniques are that are out there. So why is it important, and why is this becoming more important for the tile industry? So the easy answer to that is that tiles seem to be getting bigger, and not just a little bit bigger, they seem to be getting a lot bigger. So what once were, once upon a time 12 by 12 tiles were considered large, and then 18 by 18s were just gigantic. Now we're looking at tiles that are approaching 5 foot by 10 foot, and the shapes of the most prevalent shapes of tiles have changed, whereas almost every tile you're seeing now is a rectangle as opposed to a square. They're getting thinner in a lot of cases, and this just changes the dynamics of what we need out of our substrates. Why it's getting more and more important for the industry and for tile installers to make sure their substrate is approaching the same sort of requirements that you need to install sheet vinyl. One of the big innovations in the industry recently is the Gage porcelain tile and why it's important. And so when I referenced 5 to 10 foot tiles, 5 foot by 10 foot tiles, that's where we're talking about Gage porcelain tiles and panels, and these are becoming more and more popular and prevalent in the industry. And it's just kind of a whole new ball game. It's something very different that tile guys are used to being able to take a couple boxes of tile, throw them over their shoulder, and walk up the stairs to drop them off where they need to install them. You know, now the game is completely changed, and they're having to think completely differently. These tiles, not only are they larger, but they're flexible, which can create issues as far as you know, trying to make sure the tile is completely embedded in the setting materials, and you know, and so when you get these voids underneath, and you know, in the past, I mean, the easiest way to make sure you were getting good coverage on your tile installation was to just grab a tile and pick it up, you know, after you set it in the mortar and see how you were doing. But that's not nearly as easy when you're talking about 50 square feet of tile. And really the other thing is the liability is a lot bigger. I mean, in the days of breaking a 12 by 12 tile, it was no big deal. I mean, you could, you know, toss it to the side and maybe use it as a cut piece at the end when you hit a wall. You know, or a worst case scenario, you lost $1, and now you're talking about, you know, hundreds of dollars worth of tile if you lose a tile, and the repair process is much more complicated and labor intensive. So when we talk about shapes and rectangles and what difference does that make, whether we're installing a square or a rectangle, you know, tiles tend to have a bow, and it's even accepted that you get that it's allowed to have a certain amount of warpage. And so when you're talking about a square tile that you're setting in a straight line, what happens is you tend to, it's higher in the middle and lower on the ends. But you know, in a square, again, you're not seeing that being an issue in your installation because it all lines up, if that makes sense. Whereas once you get into you start offsetting tiles, and you know, when you get into the rectangular, you're almost always offsetting, and oftentimes people like that brick look where they're 50% offset. And you know, the industry actually suggests that you don't offset more than 33% for this reason, because you know, if you're imagining a tile that is at its highest in the middle of the tile and its lowest on the end, you know, that's where the idea of offsetting something 50% can really cause a challenge. And so, but now we're also looking at, you know, not just 12 by 24s, which is probably the most common size tile that we're seeing these days, but then very close to that would be these plank looks, the wood look tiles. So now you're talking about rectangles that you know, anywhere from, you know, 6 inches by, I've seen as much as, you know, 48 inches or greater. And so again, this is just something to consider because it's inherent in the nature of the tile. And so and all that being said, and that picture shows is, you know, you see that little lip there and that term lippage, and you know, that's not a new concern in the industry. And so when we talk about lippage, I mean, this has kind of been you know, this has always been the visual indicator of a problem with a tile install. So this is, again, for a tile installer, this is nothing new. A tile installer is very well aware that for him to get off the job and get paid, that what he really needs to do is make sure all these tiles are lined up perfectly. And so, and it's a lot of times it's harder to show. I mean, this picture does a good job of showing it, and that's usually what does it, is a nice long area with a glare running across it, and that sheen and that glare do a good job of showing any imperfections. But in a lot of residential applications where you may not see it, you certainly can feel it. And you know, so the name of the game in the past was always, okay, well, I'm not, you know, while they may not be that concerned about the substrate, they were always concerned about being able to achieve at the surface, that these tiles all lined up. And because again, I mean, that was the biggest indicator. That's what kept them. I mean, if somebody was going to say, no, there's a problem with this installation and I'm not paying you for it until you fix it, it was generally because they were catching their feet when they walked across their new floor. And so again, lippage is not a new issue, but how we're coming to look at it and how to avoid it is becoming much more technical than just trying to make sure our edges line up like in the past. So how do we know that lippage matters and that this has been an issue in the industry? So these are just a couple examples of documents that the industry has published. I mean, we've got the TCNA has an entire page referencing it, and you've got ANSI has it referenced. You have our hosts here at the NTCA have a page dedicated to it in their handbook. And so again, this is not a new issue. So when we talk about what contributes to lippage, so there are things here that the tile installer can and cannot control. And so again, they're used to dealing with a lot of this. And so because again, they get handed a tile that has warpage and varying thicknesses, and whether the edges are whether the edges line up, and so there are certain things that they can't control, but what they can control is how flat the substrate is. They can also control the size of the grout joints, and so these are factors that really play into the amount of lippage you end up with in installation. So if we are going to try to make sure that we have a flat substrate, we kind of need to start at the beginning. So when we talk about a concrete substrate, and when you ask the American Concrete Institute, what does flat mean, and what are the requirements? Because again, this is not what an installer is handed is not really up to the installer. This is up to this is something that's been, whether it's a new slab, obviously determined at the time of installation, or over the years, what's happened to the slab if you've been doing demo or whatever from previous flooring installations. And so the American Concrete Institute, or the ACI, they use an FF scale and the floor flatness scale, and it's and you see that on the left side of the chart there, the FF ratings. So with the lower number being less flat, less stringent in the flatness, all the way up to 100. So the higher the number, the flatter the substrate. So there's not an official correlation between FF numbers and then what we use in the tile industry. So in the tile industry, we typically talk about we talk about variation over a 10-foot span. So taking a 10-foot straight edge and running it across the floor and looking for any variation greater than 1/4 of an inch, or in other instances, an 1/8 of an inch. And so while this is not official, this is kind of what the industry goes by as far as, to give you a guide of what to expect. And so with an FF rating of 25, you're at 1/4 of an inch drop over, or variation over 10 feet, and then all the way up to a 50 to achieve an 1/8. And then if you look over on the right, you're seeing that, from a conventional, at 20 to something considered moderately flat, there's a fair amount of variation, but there's other factors involved in this, and we'll kind of keep looking at that here as we go. So something else to consider here is that when the FF numbers are read, are checked and then signed off on, it's usually at 72 hours, after the slab was poured. So and if you know anything about concrete, the magic number typically is, you talk about 28 days for curing, but it's still not dry at that point, and there's still a lot of drying, and there's still a fair amount of movement that occurs after that. Now, when we talk about the concrete contractors versus the tile installers, and when they're on a job site, you're talking about Division 3 versus Division 9. So there, depending on the scale and the size of the project, I mean, you're looking at months oftentimes in between. And so you've got a slab that has been measured, and so if it meets whatever standard that might be, if it was the 25 and we're signing off on that and saying that should get us close to 1/4 inch and 10 feet. Okay, bear in mind that was at 72 hours after the slab was installed, and so we can, and what we've seen is you can actually expect as much as 10-point change easily as that slab dries, because what they tend to do is they tend to curl and the sides raise up, and so what was, and all that is to say is that, you know, it's not, you know, the bane of the existence for the tile installer or the flooring installer oftentimes is they get on site and then, you know, start cussing the concrete installer, and wanting to know how in the world he got paid. But the reality is, you know, that was checked and signed off on, and it was within tolerances at one point. But in the time since that they left, that slab has started drying, and it's moved and it's changed. And so while it might have been, you know, reasonable slab to work with once upon a time, it's now a big problem and something very difficult for the tile installer to overcome. So the NTCA reference manual gets into it as well, depending on the size of the tiles and the grout joints. You know, so if you're wanting large tiles, if you're wanting narrow grout joints, to call out for an FF60. All right, so again, we're looking for a much flatter slab, and we'll get into that and different standards and why that's important, and also whether it's reinforced or not. If the slab is not reinforced, I mean, that's what really helps control movement. And so when you're talking about concrete that's just poured, you know, by itself, I mean, you're going to see incredible movement, and you see there as much as, you know, a difference of an inch and up to an inch in flatness due to concrete curling. And so, and that's just to give you an idea, I mean, you know, of how much concrete can move and over time. And you know, and again, as we'll move along, we're kind of starting at the bottom of the sandwich here, but you know, why we end up in this industry and some of the situations we end up in. So what do the standards say? And I apologize, I meant to tell you this at the beginning. I came back, we had our big show, industry trade show in Las Vegas last week, and I've not been feeling all that great. So at some point it may start to sound like a bullfrog is talking to you on the other end. And so I've got some tea here, some hot tea that I'm trying to keep from getting too rough here. But so I apologize if it starts to sound that way. But with the standards, so ANSI, you know, when we talk, and a lot of this again has to do with the size of the tile. And so when we talk about tiles with at least one edge of 15 inches or greater, I mean, this is pretty standard now. I mean, tiles are either really big or they're really small. There's not a whole lot of in between anymore. So you know, most tiles are considered large and heavy, large format tiles with an edge over 15 inches. And when that's the case, we can't have more than 1/8 of an inch and 10 feet in variation. So again, that's tightening up what we need there. And then over a 2-foot section, we can't have more than a 1/16 inch of variation. So and that's an ANSI. So I mean, that is a standard for tile installation, and that's something that needs to be achieved. And that, you know, as a tile contractor, that's something that needs to be addressed, and not just that it's necessarily your responsibility, but it needs to be addressed with the GC and design professionals, that, you know, this is what is needed. You know, if this is what's specified, this size of tile, I need this flat of a floor, and if it doesn't exist when I get on site, then something's going to have to be done to correct that. So we've talked a lot about concrete, but you know, that's not the only thing that we run into when tile gets installed. Wood substrates, you know, certainly in residential applications, you see this a fair amount, but we're looking basically at the same sorts of qualifications and standards here. We're still looking for the same flatness. You know, the problem is that can be really difficult to achieve in modern building practices. And you know, when you think about a piece of plywood that's nailed down over joists, and you know, what are the odds that those joists are completely level, and then that wood kind of bends and fills in, and and it's real easy to get a wavy substrate that moves all over the place, and certainly within even small areas, within that 2-foot section, trying to measure a 1/16 of an inch, so no more than a 1/16 of an inch variation. Oftentimes materials that are being used, I mean, there's lots of value engineering out there. You're seeing more and more OSB. The joists get moved out wider and wider, and so now it's a lot harder to get a flat floor that's up to specs, and so we're seeing less of the tongue and groove plywood as well. So again, those are just things to consider. I mean, just because it's wood, I mean, we're still trying to achieve the same level of flatness. So what about walls? Well, once upon a time, walls, basically, if they were getting tile, it was probably because it was a backsplash or a tub surround or a shower, and they were getting a 4 1/4 tile, 4 by 4 tile, and it really didn't matter that much. And so the idea of really trying to spend much time or pay much attention to how flat a wall is probably even a newer idea in the industry. As tile becomes more and more popular as a wall finish, it's become you see all sorts of decorative accent walls and things like that that are all tile, and large format tiles, giant, these Gage porcelain tile panels, are often used on wall, and that's actually one of the more popular uses for them. And so now we're having to look at walls, and we're treating them the same way. But again, it's not easy. You're talking about substrates that are usually applied over studs that, just like joists, I mean, what are the odds that those are all perfectly in line, so that when it's nice and easy to drop those on and install them, and you have a nice flat floor. I mean, typically, if you look at whether it's drywall or or cement backer board or something like that, and if you were to look down a long wall that had been finished off, that had been covered with one of those, you're going to see all sorts of bows in it, and it's usually at every joist. And so again, this creates big challenges, and we need to be able to get that wall to the same standards as the floors. So we've talked a lot about, okay, so it's important, we've got to do this, and how maybe it's a newer idea to the tile industry than other facets of floor covering. So now we get to the point of like, well, okay, so if we're going to do this, how do we achieve this? And what are the options available to the industry? So both on the specification side as well as on the installation side. We've got listed here some of the different methods, starting with kind of the old standby and previous ideas on how to fix a floor and how to get a tile installation flat, versus as we'll move through to some of the newer methods and that are becoming more and more accepted in the tile industry. So the make it up with thin set method is the tried and true method for most tile installers. And so if you remember the picture on the first page at the beginning of the installation, this is kind of a similar situation with a much smaller tile. I mean, you're looking at a 12 by 24 tile, and what you're seeing there is they've taken the time to comb out the mortar on the substrate, but clearly that was not enough for them. The mortar that was set, the thin set that was put down, was not enough for them to be able to line up the edges of the tile. And again, this is where the disconnect has kind of come, I think, in the tile industry. It's always been more about lining up at any cost lining up the edges, right? So because again, that's how we get off the job and get paid. But what we leave behind in these efforts is tiles that are not supported correctly, that could debond, that are more likely to crack, and they're not properly supported. And so what you see there is, again, they've taken the time to comb the mortar, but it wasn't enough for them to achieve what they needed to achieve. So they ended up putting, they take globs of mortar and put it in each corner and then one in the middle. Now, to this installer's credit, they did add 4 more globs than usual. Usually you see 5. You see 1 in each corner and 1 in the middle. So there are 4 extra small globs there to give it a little extra protection. But again, you've wasted a lot of resources here. They've taken the time to spread that mortar underneath, which is essentially accomplishing nothing. That's not making contact with the tile. So it was a waste of time and mortar and money. And then now they've gone and they've put globs around the edges, and and that's all that's supporting the tile. It doesn't meet the coverage requirements. And it can cause real problems. And so, but again, this is what's always been done. I mean, this was, again, and I really think it goes back to the idea of, look, we're just trying to line up these edges so we can get off the job. And so other methods that we've traditionally used are the mud beds, the mortar bed, or the more traditional term mud bed. And this is a sand and cement mix, generally somewhere in the range of 4, 5, 6 parts sand to 1 part cement, a little bit of water, and it's great for you pack it in. You can shape it with a float or a screed. You don't. And this has always been the traditional method for a tile installer to put together a to prepare a substrate. If they're going to do anything other than just stick a little extra thin set underneath it, this is what's been done. And what's nice about this method is this really allows you to shape your substrate. So when you're needing to create a slope, and if you're in an exterior situation, or certainly in a shower or something like that, where you need to create a slope to a drain or a slope away from a building, this is what you want to use. We're going to talk about self-levelers, and so obviously, something called a self-leveler is probably not going to be very good at sloping. And if it is, you probably need to question how good of a self-leveler it is. So this is still a useful method and product in the industry, but it's a lot of these products can take time to dry, and you're having to shape it, and so you can still take the time to do all this. And even though you've put an entire mud bed in, you have to be very careful once you've screeded and floated it in that you haven't created any low points or created any more issues on your own. So there are products now called modified muds, which basically means they have polymer added, latex added to them. And this has been, over the years, guys have mixed it on site, used their own sand, own cement, and then there are companies that would sell latex additives, and so you could mix all of that on site, and it gives you higher performance, certainly for if you're going to have rolling loads or if you're going to be exterior. But now there's a lot of products on the market that are basically your mud mixes in a bag that you can buy that are already modified, and now we've even got rapid setting ones. And so when we get into large scale projects, we're like if you're doing an apartment building or a hotel, and you're wanting to you're doing multiple bathrooms, and and then oftentimes when tile installers are working in on a project, it's not air conditioned or heated, so you've got varying conditions on site, and schedules are always tight. And so when you're talking about just sand and cement mixed together, it depends on how much water you put in it and what the conditions are. Is it hot? Is it humid? Dry? Cold? As to how fast that water is going to evacuate out. And it's always a rush to move on, so that you can start waterproofing and get ready to flood test and move on with the installation. So now there are products that are designed to not only have high strength, but also set up quickly so that you can move on waterproof and get going with your installation even quicker. You also see when we're talking about prepping walls, there are products designed specifically for that. The top picture shows you kind of the traditional, if you were going to try to float out a wall, because now you don't have gravity working with you, you have it working against you. So you see that scratch coat underneath, where you put the mud mix on the wall, and then you scratch it, and you put grooves in it basically with a trowel, and then you let it dry, and then you come back and then you fill those in and build up more mortar on top so that you can flatten out the substrate, and that's the scratch coat and scratch and render coats that have been traditionally used in the industry. But then you've also got now new products that are designed so that, again, to fast track projects, you can just open a bag, mix it up. There are fiber reinforced products out there that you can apply to the wall. You don't have to do the scratch coat. They'll bond directly to concrete, to to a block wall, to whether CMU or a CBU, the cement backer units. So again, there are a lot of options, and a lot of these are designed to dry quickly. So again, you can waterproof and move on with your installation. So we've also seen the grind and patch. Now, when we talk about in my history in the industry, I've seen this a lot of times. I spent a lot of time in the Texas market, and the residential builder market is a huge driver of flooring sales in that market. I mean, a lot of the southern markets have seen a lot of residential growth over the last 20 years, and in these production builders, you'll have installers come in on a brand new slab, and I often got the complaint they're going in to install a wood floor and in the living room and dining room and entry area, so maybe 1,000 square feet, and they're using 15 to 20 bags of patch because the substrate is up and down, and they've identified high spots, low spots, and that brings us back to the point of what installers are often good at doing is identifying low spots and saying, okay, I need to fill these in, and so these guys are floating out with a patching compound basically an entirely new slab, when what they probably could have done is identified a couple high spots that were creating all the low spots around it, and you take a grinder and you go hit that high spot, grind it down, and now you've got a flat subfloor. So I mean, that was one of the things we used to work with installers all the time let's be smart about this. And so we don't necessarily need to dump 20 bags of patch on, which great from our standpoint as a manufacturer in the industry is great, but from their productivity side and from a cost factor, the builders are never real impressed with that method. And so it's just an idea of saying, like, what do I have here? If I just have a couple of high spots that are creating all the problems, let's just get rid of the high spots. But then certainly patching has been around for years and years and years in other industries, on the soft side of the industry, but on the tile side, it's relatively new. I mean, guys aren't really used to patching. And one of the things is with tile, nobody's ever really worried about moisture, and it's not generally a big concern coming up from the substrate. Whereas in other floor covering, you got moisture sensitive products that you're installing, so guys are more worried about it. So they know if they've got high moisture, and so for tile guys, there are patches on the market that are great that you can fill in small areas that just need to be brought up a little bit, between a couple high spots. But they also aren't affected by moisture. So if you don't have any idea whether there's high moisture in the slab, you can go ahead and just use that patch and then install your tile, and you don't have anything to worry about. So it's not necessarily a new advancement, but it's definitely relatively new to the tile industry, or self-levelers. And this is going back to talking about installers using 15, 20 bags of patch to smooth out a surface or level out a surface. That's very labor intensive when you're on your knees and you're having to pull that float back and forth the whole time. You know, self-levelers were designed to get you off your knees and basically be able to prep and flatten out, level out large areas in a short amount of time. They're highly flowable. They seek their own level. Again, they smooth out on their own, and then they dry very, very quickly. Despite what that picture may look like, you know, there are levelers on the market that will be, you can be walking on in an hour and setting tile. And so even though they look like that when applied. So when you talk about self-levelers, I mean, there's no shortage of different types of self-levelers that are out there. So it's just something to be aware of, so you know what you're working with, and certainly if you're on the specification side, what you're specifying. So the great majority of them are cement-based. They're flowable. I mean, that's kind of the definition of what a self-leveler is. But there are gypsum-based levelers. It's just something to be aware of. You know, if you are going over a gypsum substrate, gypsum levelers are great to use. Gypsum plays really nice with gypsum, and cementitious products play nice with cementitious products. But you know, it's just something to consider. But you're typically always going to want to have a primer, regardless. You know, there are a few specialized types of levelers out there now that do not require them, but most of your standard levelers are always going to require a primer to be applied. And then from there, as far as trying to determine what's the right one to use, really it's what kind of time frame are you working on? You know, there are levelers that, like I said, can set up very, very quickly. Others that, you know, typically cost a little less, you know, it takes a little bit longer, so maybe a day to set up before you're installing tile. But again, there are products on the market that'll have you setting tile, you know, in just a couple hours. There are lightweight levelers, so if that's a concern, something to look for. There are skim coating levelers, so if you're just needing to smooth out and get a nice smooth surface and pull it really thin, there are products that can do that. And they're even moisture resistant. So again, when you talk about tile, we put tile in pools and fountains, right? So historically, people have never really worried about moisture with tile installations, but there are real concerns, and as far as with current installation techniques. You've got there are membranes that are applied now underneath tile that are oftentimes moisture sensitive. There are aesthetic issues that come along with high moisture moving through a tile installation. And the most common is efflorescence, and that's, you know, if you've ever seen, you know, the white powdery stuff on the surface of a tile, on the grout joints, or running down the face of a tile. Excuse me. That's typically what you're seeing there, and so while that doesn't necessarily cause any harm to the installation itself, as far as structurally, it is an aesthetic issue that, you know, that generally the end user is not real thrilled with. And so, but again, if you aren't checking for moisture and you are going to put a leveler down, there are moisture resistant levelers that can go underneath tile. So when you are going to, if you do select a self leveler, it's very important to take a look at the surface prep guidelines for that leveler. There are some that are considered low prep options, but others often require what's called a concrete surface profile of 3. And so, and generally the way to achieve that is through a mechanical means, which is generally shot blasting. And so when we talk about needing a profile, there are chipsets that are available. The International Concrete Repair Institute, ICRI, has a chipset, and they're numbered from 1 to 10. And as you go through from starting at 1 going to 10, it gets rougher and rougher, essentially. And so when somebody talks about a CSP or a concrete surface profile, that's what they're referencing, and the number is designated by these chipsets that are provided by ICRI. So it doesn't just create a profile. It also opens up the surface, gives porosity, which is also important for getting a really good bond. If you look at this, when we talk about shot blasting, so that picture shows you on the right where you see that dull concrete versus the left where it's shiny. You know, the side on the right has been prepped already. The shot blaster or bead blaster, which is essentially a machine that shoots tiny little shot, like you might see in a shotgun shell, down onto the concrete substrate. And it basically pulverizes the surface, and then there's a high-powered vacuum system and magnet system that recaptures the beads and then evacuates the dust. But it gives you, again, that profile to hold on to, as well as it removes things, you know, if there's sealers on the surface or that have even penetrated down, you know, paint, waxes, all sorts of contaminants that, again, if you try to bond to that, you know, if that's what's sitting on the surface, that's what you're going to bond to. And if that releases, then your whole installation is coming up. So we ask for, you know, so that's something definitely to consider when you're looking at what you're using, and is very important. Same thing for wood surfaces. Again, so with current construction, if you're dealing with a wood substrate and you're wanting to put a self-leveler down, you're going to want to use some sort of lath with that, and that's going to and once that is inside the leveler, once the leveler pours and forms around it, it reinforces the strength of that leveler. Because again, I mean, I don't think I'm breaking any news to you, but you know, if you're standing on concrete versus a plywood subfloor over joists, I mean, you're going to expect the concrete to be more stable and to have less deflection, and that's where you know, when you hear about deflection in our industry, you'll hear L over 360, or if you're doing certainly on natural stone installations, L over 720. And what that is that's a measure of the deflection in the floor. And so it's if you want to talk about it offline, we can dig more deeply into it. But again, it's basically that's just an equation of saying, you know, you're measuring the length between joists and putting that in inches, dividing it by 360, and that's giving you a number that's the max deflection you can have. But at the end of the day, what you need to understand here is, you know, when we're installing tile, I mean, this is a rigid finish, so deflection is not your friend. You do not want movement underneath. So we want the subfloor to be as firm as possible. And the same thing for a self-leveler. So just certain things to make sure you consider. I mentioned primers earlier. There's lots of different types of primers. You know, there epoxy primers, acrylic primers. You know, there are primers now with aggregate added to them, like a sand aggregate, so that you get a rough surface when you're done. And it's kind of makes it can oftentimes take the place of something like shot blasting. So if you have a smooth, non-porous surface, there are primers on the market that you can roll on that will dry quickly with a rough texture with an aggregate inside of it, encapsulated inside of it. And then so you can skip that step of having to bring in a machine to shot blast or bead blast or you know, or grind or do any other form of mechanical preparation. And so it's just something to consider. Again, there are very few levelers on the market that do not require a primer. So generally speaking, if you are looking this route, you need to plan on having a primer and make sure that that's on your radar if you're planning on using a self-leveler. Again, just some general pointers when you're using them. I mean, this is very different than getting on your hands and knees and spreading thin set or, you know, a patch. So you've got a very, you know, fluid material here, and so it will go wherever, you know, wherever gravity takes it. And so you want to make sure you've done your planning in advance, and so make sure you control the flow. I've seen some pretty ugly instances where this stuff has gone down some holes and found its way into some unfortunate places down below. You know, so those are just plans to make in advance. If you see a whirlpool in your self-leveler, that's usually not a good sign. But again, the big thing with self-levelers is to do your planning and prep in advance. And you know, once you start pouring this, I mean, it goes really quick, and you can cover huge areas in a very short period of time. So when we talk about mixing, I mean, generally, I mean, this is something that, you know, if you're not used to using it, it's not a one-man job to mix and then carry in and pour self-levelers. There needs to be multiple people involved. You know, with the mixing station generally ready. You see here in this picture, I mean, there are large projects where they pour them into pumps, to mixing and pumping machines that, you know, like I say, you can see here, it could be on the back of a truck, you know, and pump these, they pump through a hose up to wherever, you know, wherever your project, you know, wherever you're needing to apply it. And, you know, so you can certainly cover large areas in a very short period of time. But mixing is very important. I mean, you need to follow the directions. Do not overwater. And so, I mean, this kind of goes for all products, cementitious products. When we ask you to add water, we're usually not guessing on the amount we tell you to use. There's generally been a fair amount of research done behind that. And so, and this picture right here, what it shows you is so the same leveler as more and more water is added to it. And so, and these are just some of the indicators. And now that's not to say, if you see any color variation after a leveler is applied and dried, that it's automatically there's an issue. But it's certainly an indicator at times. You can kind of see it gets lighter and lighter, and you know, but what it does is it pushes everything further and further apart. The cement particles, the polymers, you know, everything that gives these products their strength. And so, you know, so just like I said, if it tells you how much water to use on it, no matter who the manufacturer is, go ahead and go with that. Trust me, they know. Then it pours out. Again, this is just to give you an idea, show you the, you know, what these products look like when they're poured out, highly fluid. There are certain tools you'll want to have, gauge rakes and smoothers, porcupine rollers, all sorts of things like that are tools of the trade. You know, spike shoes, you know, cleats, stuff like that. I mean, don't wear your favorite shoes if you're going to stand in the middle of this stuff. They will never be the same. Again, these are some of the tools. But it's important to understand. So like a gauge rake, what a gauge rake does is it sets the depth. So while these products do a good job of finding their own level and smoothing out really well, what they don't know how to do is they don't know how deep they're supposed to go. So they do need help. So if you've identified an area that needs 1/4 of an inch, you can't just go dump 5 bags of leveler there, you know, dump it out there and walk away from it and assume that it's going to go to 1/4 of an inch. The gauge rake, you set it at 1/4 of an inch, and then that allows you to push and pull the material around over high spots, you know, to the next low spot, things like that you're trying to fill in. And that way you'll get, if you don't use a tool like that, you probably will come up short on a job. So because it'll end up probably being thicker than it needs to be. And then once you're done with that, you know, just keep it protected. Each product is different as far as you know, how long it needs to be protected. It depends on the drying time. So again, some of these you can be back on really quickly and installing tile or installing other finished goods. Now, you know, but on job sites, it is always important to keep an eye on. You know, there's always the next crew is standing behind you waiting for you to finish, and you know, they've got their scissor lifts or forklifts or whatever heavy rolling loads they've got ready to go rolling across your floor. So just make sure you protect it. You know, check the data sheet for whatever product you're using. And you know, again, that's pretty much it. I mean, just to recap, I mean, again, it's not necessarily new for this industry, but it's becoming more and more important. And a lot of these things are you know, like self-levelers that, you know, once upon a time, I mean, if you had told a tile installer you needed to self-level a floor before an install, he would have told you you're crazy. And so, but it's becoming more and more accepted, and it's the mindset is starting to change because these tiles are getting so big. It is such a difficult installation to achieve if the floor is not flat. And so if you have a floor that's moving all over the place and now you're installing these giant tiles, it's just a nightmare. And you know, and so it's just part of the industry. It's part of, it's part of the innovation. The industry is always changing, and what manufacturers like ourselves are always trying to do is create newer and better products that make it easier for the installers to achieve what needs to be achieved. Whether it's prep or the actual setting material. And so this is just something that everybody needs to be aware of, and even on the design side, it's never been as big of an issue as it is now. But it's something that the entire from the entire construction industry needs to be aware of, as these tiles have gotten larger and thinner, and the game has changed from what it once was, and so it's just something that needs to be considered on all facets for a tile installation. And that is the end. So I very much appreciate your taking your time this afternoon. And
Logan, before everyone leaves, let them know how they can get their AIA CEU credits.
Okay, we can. If you'll, basically, what we need to do is we just need to have your information. You can send it to my email, Reavis@Mapei. Your attendance register, and we can take care of that on our end.
I'm going to type that in at the bottom of our chat screen here, your email, and let everybody know. So if everybody hangs on for a moment and gets that email, for those of you that want the CEU from AIA, from the architects, just hold on 1 minute and I'll be sending it to you. Keep talking, Logan.
All right. So yeah, so lreavis@mapei.com. But again, I don't know if there were any questions, but
there was no questions, at least so far, but a lot of people say thank you and appreciate all the information that you gave. I know this was your first time giving us a webinar, and we really appreciate it. Thank you very much for that. And I want to thank everybody. Please look on your chat screen. You'll see lreavis@mapei.com for your AIA CEU. Do not hesitate to contact him. He'll get you all set up for that. And continue to watch for invites for our ongoing webinars. We will have another one later this month, and invites will be coming out shortly. And we appreciate all of you attending. Logan, you did a great job. Lots of information there, and very thorough. So thanks, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Logan.